Good afternoon. My name is Tom Romero. I am a professor of law and history. I'm also the assistant provost of inclusive excellence research and curricular initiatives here at the University of Denver in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And I am also get the honor of being able to work with a tremendous group of people with the Interdisciplinary Research Institute for the Study of Inequality, or IRISE. So thank you all for being here today. Before we get started, I wanted to thank a couple people associated with iRise in terms of the important work that they had in putting this together. One of our iRise postdoctoral fellows, Dr. Sherry Coulter, back there. One of our graduate assistants, Lisa Colon. I think Lisa's here. Both of them worked tirelessly in putting the program together, putting the slides together, working on technology issues that I'm going to talk about here in a bit. I also want to point out, too, the wonderful food that you're eating today comes from Comal. And for those of you that are not familiar with Comal, it is an incubator that is designed to help low-income, largely Latinx, but also new immigrant women in the neighborhoods of Swansea, Globeville. These are some of our poorest communities, some of our most diverse communities here in the Denver area. And it's designed to give them opportunities to be entrepreneurs and also to be able to take their foods of their cultures, right, and be able to participate, right, in this economy that we're part of. So, so the food that you're having comes from Comal there. And really, it's about job training and economic resilience. Also want to acknowledge the fact here that our presentation today, all this work, all of you that are here with the University of Denver know that we sit on the historic homelands of the Arapaho and Cheyenne, right? And this goes back centuries. And those of you that are also here connected to the University of Denver know our historic connection as the University of Denver, from our founder, John Evans, to members of our Board of Trustees that participated directly, right, in the removal and even the genocide, right, of Arapaho and Cheyenne, that contributed in particular to the Sand Creek Massacre, the killing of elders, women, and children of Arapaho and Cheyenne. So I want to acknowledge that that is because of their sacrifices, their hardships, that we have the privilege to learn and to talk today. Today is kind of a special day, so I'm really happy that all of you are here. This is when iRise goes public with a very new initiative. And this initiative is really about how and in what ways the University of Denver in particular, but institutions of higher education more generally, can be involved in the issue of racial justice. And this is, for those of you that have been here at the University of Denver for a long time, this is not necessarily something that has been central to the core values and tenets of the university, but it's something that students have been engaged in, faculty have been engaged in, staff have been engaged in a variety of levels. So we are here today in terms of thinking about this, how the university and higher education can be engaged in this conversation and in these spaces. We are privileged to have here a wonderful panel of experts that can help us walk us through these issues. And I'm very quickly going to introduce our experts before I turn it over. Dr. Mary Romero, who is a professor at Arizona State University. She's also the current president of the American Sociological Association. And she has long been engaged in terms of her scholarship and research in terms of social justice, racial justice. She's involved in LAC Crit. Those of you that know a little bit about Dr. Romero might also know that she's using her presidency and the perch of that presidency to highlight the importance of social justice and racial justice in the work of sociologists in particular. To Dr. Romero's right is Dr. Melina Abdullah, who is the chair and a professor in the Pan-African Studies program at California State University, Los Angeles. She was also one of the original organizers of the Black Lives Matter movement. She has a radio program. She's an activist. She's a scholar. She's a feminist, a womanist, and she's also very connected to one of our iRise postdoctoral fellows, Dr. Johnny Ramirez, who is right over here, who was also able to make the connection and to bring Dr. Abdullah here. So a big round of applause for Dr. Abdullah. And then finally, who will also be a participant but also moderating the discussion is Dr. Professor Cesar Garcia Hernandez, who's one of my colleagues over in the School of Law. Professor Garcia Hernandez is one of the world's foremost experts on the intersection between criminal law and immigration, which he has put together, and he's editor-in-chief of the internationally known Crimmigration blog. So, Cesar? Before I turn it over, our presentation today, we want it to be as interactive as possible. And those of you that are coming from other parts of campus know that Wi-Fi is down, right? We actually had a whole Wi-Fi plan for you to submit questions that would be presented on the screen, but we did have a plan B in place. So all of you will see on your tables note cards and pens, right? So I'm going to encourage you all, as the conversation is happening, as we have questions that are coming up, start submitting your questions. Start writing your questions down. Raise your hands when those are ready. We will have people around the room ready to pick those up, and they'll bring them up to Professor Garcia Hernandez. So that'll be our format today. We're going to go to about 1:20 in terms of the conversation, and then we'll have some final concluding remarks. So without further ado.
Welcome, everyone. It's really quite an honor to be here with these esteemed colleagues, and it's really an enormous pleasure of mine to get to moderate this panel in front of a room full of people. This is certainly the kind of event that I like to think is the future of the University of Denver, and rather than some of the kinds of lack of critical thoughts on issues of race and justice in the United States that unfortunately has been more characteristic of the university's past. But my job is to help guide a conversation, a conversation with the wonderful engaged intellectuals that we have here in the room, and I use that description intentionally because these are folks who are not simply weighing in on matters of huge significance, of public importance, but they are doing so in a manner that is pushing our sophistication of the thinking that is happening on truly critically important topics. And they're doing it from their positions within the academy, but certainly are not by any means confined to those positions. And so I want to get the conversation started by asking them to describe how they became the engaged intellectuals, the scholars that they are now, and specifically also to address what it means to be a race scholar in the United States in the early 21st century in this particular political moment that we're living through. So.
Okay. So thank you for having me. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here because I have friends here, but also because I haven't seen the snow in like 20 years. And I walked out, I was like, what's this falling from the sky? So that was great. Hopefully it won't fall too much. So what does it mean to be a race scholar? I don't know. I don't know if I've ever defined myself as that. I think that it betrays who we are if we don't bring all of who we are into everything that we do. And so I'm a black woman, and so I couldn't take space in a classroom and facilitate an experience of learning without being a black woman and speaking from that perspective. For me, that's meant that even though my PhD is in political science, that my home discipline is in Black studies. It's in Pan-African studies. And the reason that my home discipline is in Pan-African studies, and that was always the only place I've ever wanted to be, is because Pan-African studies, Black studies, when I was a young girl feeling disconnected from education, it was Black studies that saved my life, like literally, you know. So I don't want to tell you my whole life story, but now that I'm not really 29, I've learned that I start telling more stories than I used to, right? So I'll just be real quick about it. So I was born in the 70s in Oakland, California. Some people call my generation Generation X. We call ourselves the hip-hop generation, but the truth about who we are, Black children of the 70s, we're the Panther Cub generation, right? So we have some real Panther Cubs, right? And then we also have folks like me. I'm from Oakland in the 70s. My parents were not members of the Black Panther Party, but were absolutely in and around the Black Panther Party. So my mother was a community other mother that taught children how to read, that participated in the free breakfast programs. And so that's the era at which I came of age. But then, or that's the era at which I was born, but I came of age in the 90s, right? And so if we think about what was happening in the 90s, crack cocaine hit Oakland especially really, really hard. And there was this kind of tearing apart of my soul. And a lot of people experienced this, right? Where you're pulled in one direction by what's imposed on your neighborhood, by what's imposed on us as Black people, but then you also have this consciousness. So my mother knew that I shouldn't go to school in Oakland because the school I was supposed to go to, this is how they set you up, right? So Manning Marable talks about how these institutions create these outcomes on purpose, intentionally, right? So I lived like walking distance from a school called Oakland High School, but I was far away from a school called Fremont High School. But I lived in an area of Oakland called Funktown. There were two kind of warring neighborhoods in East Oakland, Funktown and 69th Village. They decided to send the children from Funktown to the school in 69th Village. That school was so violent my senior year that they had to close the school down 2 weeks early because too many children had been killed coming to campus, right? So my mother knew not to send me to Fremont, so we did what a lot of people did and lie about our address, and I went to Berkeley High, which was the only high school in the country that had a Black Studies department. And so this is wrapping up the story. So I went to Berkeley High, and I was literally saved by Black Studies and the teacher there, Mr. Navies. And I sat in classrooms where I didn't go to regular U.S. history classes. We were allowed to take African American history 1 and 2. We didn't have to take regular English. We could take Black Gold English. We could take African American literature. We could take African American journalism. We could take Swahili. We could take African Haitian dance for PE. And it awakened me to who I am and to what my potential was. Not immediately, because I dropped out of high school in the 11th grade, but it planted seeds. And so for me, when I went back to school, I wound up graduating I went to independent studies and wound up graduating from high school and then went to Howard. When I went back to school, there was no question about what I would study, because for me, there was only one thing that would connect me with the process of intellectual development. And so I was an African American Studies major at Howard. And that's why I teach Pan-African Studies now, because I see in my students who I was, right? A need to connect with the intellectual process, not to be kind of imposed upon by an institution that is never invested, in fact, is opposed to Black liberation. And so that's, I guess, what makes me a race scholar, but more deeply, that's why I do the kind of work that I do in the classroom.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for inviting me. I want to extend my appreciation to everyone who helped organize this event. Thank you very much. This is a bit of a homecoming for me because I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and I went to high school here, to a place that doesn't exist anymore called Cathedral High School, which was probably the only integrated high school that Denver has ever had. And I don't think that that situation has changed much. Maybe that's one reason they had to get rid of it. I don't know. But then later I went to Regis College. And I think that when Professor or Dean Romero invited us and he said to talk about your journey, how you got here, I don't think I'd be the person I was if I hadn't grown up in Denver, because my parents coming from New Mexico without high school graduations, growing up here, my father remembers a lot of signs saying no Mexicans and no dogs allowed. I never saw anything like that. But again, I never saw a Mexican-American teacher. I never saw a Black teacher. That goes for grade school, it goes for high school. I never have seen a Mexican-American priest when I was growing up in the Denver area. And so I always saw us as people who were the ones doing the work, and there was always the overseer, the white person that was in that position. And having grown up during the period of the Chicano movement, and as I was mentioning to someone earlier, coming home from school on the bus, passing West High School, seeing some of the kids get on the bus all bloodied. And even though I didn't have the kind of political understanding at that time, curiosity started what was going on. And although my very conservative mother kept saying, you can't get involved, you just go to school, mind your own business. Fortunately, my father was more curious about it, and although he wasn't encouraging for me to get involved, he let me know that he was supportive of the choices that I was going to make. And I made those choices to get involved with racial activities when I was in college, and it changed me. Going to Regis College, we had a very small Mexican-American population there, and for me that turned out to be a real advantage because it taught me at a very young age to start working intersectionality and start coalition building with the African-American students that were there. And it helped me learn sort of the larger civil rights movement that was going on at that time. After that, I went to the University of Colorado at Boulder, and that's when I was drawn to sociology because I really did feel that sociology had the possibility of providing a larger understanding of what social movements might be able to obtain and the best ways to gain racial justice in this country. However, I was confronted with a sociology that didn't include sociology of race. Every time that Mexican Americans were responded to, there was in terms of ethnicity, in terms of culture, in terms of assimilation. I immediately started to hate the word assimilation and figured that it was a real detriment to sociology that it developed around that concept because it turned too many of us away from looking at the structural constraints that were causing racial discord in our community and racial suffering in our communities. So from there I started my dissertation, I looked directly at looking at examples in which the dominant culture tried to incorporate our culture in some way. And I was curious about that because it always seemed not to end up with the right kind of consequences. And so when I looked at, for instance, the first ways that bilingual education was introduced into the schools in the Denver and Boulder area, it was very clear that the teachers were still white, they were still English speaking. They hired bilingual aides who were high school, and they were treated as aides rather than as equals in the classroom. And there was important messages that were being sent to the students. It was that the person who speaks English in the classroom is the person that has the power. The person who speaks Spanish in the classroom is not the person with power. That's the person who helps you. That's the maid. That's the one who's going to care for you. And it was very clear at that time of how that the district was unwilling to sort of change their funding in order to really make a change and really introduce bilingual education. I don't know, I never followed that situation, so I don't know what the current situation here in Denver is. I also looked at the way in which insurgent movements were documented by American historians, and I looked at the El Paso Salt Wars and Las Coras Blancas, which was a group in New Mexico. And I was particularly curious at the way in which historians always documented these historical insurgent movements, that somehow there was an outside agitators, that somehow Mexican Americans didn't have the understanding, the intelligence to draw their own political analysis of what was going on and be able to create a strategy to fight for what was theirs. And the last one that I looked at was the Mental Health Center. At that time, I was teaching ESL in Lafayette, Colorado, and they were trying to introduce curanderismo into the mental health system. It was very clear that they were trying to introduce it because they felt that curanderismo was actually in competition with them. So they figured if they included their services, that it would draw a bridge to the community. But the way in which they were incorporating it was to use it as an end project. So they would only use that strategy if everything failed in their system. And again, the person that they hired was not in the same position of power as they were. So that exercise of doing that dissertation taught me a great deal about doing the analysis, understanding the structure of what was going on, and sort of framed my work in sociology. Again, I never thought of myself as being a race scholar. I guess in some ways others did, because I remember my 5 years of teaching at the University of Oregon, many of my white faculty only spoke to me when it had to do with race. I saw somebody that was Mexican American. Can you explain this? Or this happened. It was never good morning, or what do you think of the weather, or any of that. It was always about race. So somehow that was the only part of my being that they saw. And I think that that sort of has formed me to understand the way that the larger society sees us, particularly when we're in positions of power. And they rarely see us as peers, as their equals, and willing to participate in sort of a larger agenda, but try and squeeze out just sort of this small little piece that's race. But if we don't deal with the larger issue, we can't change the larger society.
Well, it's fascinating to hear the stories about both of you. I was struck describe moments of violence in your early lives, moments in which education was should we say violence was an obstacle to obtaining your educations, and yet you've made your professional lives in educational environments, and they have clearly had such a formative impact on you becoming the people you are. So I'm wondering if you could talk now a little bit about how you, and specifically how you incorporate race into the professional work that you do as a scholar, as a teacher, and also in terms of the service that you do on a daily basis.
Okay. In terms of teaching, the courses I teach, I always use an intersectional approach so that I include race as well as gender and class. I think too often we forget about class, which I think is extremely important. And let me say that one of the reasons I think class is so important is because coming from my generation of one of the sort of the first generation of sociology scholars, I was confronted with their African Americans and Puerto Ricans, and many of them had already had a generation of intellectuals, of scholars. And I was sort of emerging on a scene in which there were very, very few Mexican Americans that had a PhD. And I learned very quickly that these first generations of African American scholars and Puerto Rican scholars, many of them are the sons and daughters of small business owners. And so they had acquired a certain level of a middle-class life. And it posed a difference to me when I realized that starting out coming from a working-class background or a working-poor background and going into academia is very different than going from a middle-class background, regardless of color. At least you have some kind of culture, capital that is shared that you can draw on to help you. So understanding class was very important to me. And using that in class, I have taught my class in racial justice, for instance, by looking at some of the larger social issues that people are dealing with today, such as environmental racism, looking at issues of housing, getting the students to understand the larger issues of housing. It just didn't start today, but there's a long history of housing segregation and in which the government played a big part in that. Looking at police violence. I've always found it very important to look at all communities of color and talking about race. I think it's important for students to see not only the differences that they might have in their experiences, but most of all the similarities in the structural constraints that are placed, racial structural constraints that are placed on all of these groups. In terms of service, that has largely, in the past, been working with community organizations on issues of police shootings or immigration. More recently, it's been on a professional level, and I'm not quite sure how that happened. I'm obviously the first president of the Sociological Association that is Mexican American. I am the first one that ever was elected from a state university rather than one of the Ivy Leagues. And I think that it's a larger statement about who's out there in sociology. They're sick and tired of the elitism. They're sick and tired of electing folks that don't represent them, that don't represent their same trajectory that they went through in their career, that didn't have the same kinds of elite funding that many of these universities have to offer. And so I'm sort of an oddball in this history of being the 110th president of sociology. So I feel a real strong obligation to celebrate those people out there and to make the older generation to understand that sociology is changing, whether they like it or not, because social knowledge is socially situated. And we have some new voices out there. They have new experiences. They're asking new questions. And we're also reclaiming sociology from Du Bois to the present rather than their white founding fathers that are usually cited in textbooks. Okay.
So I just want to kind of address I think something that comes up is the need to understand. I agree that we have to address intersectionality. So we have to speak from an intersectional space. We have to enter institutions as our whole and complete selves with, an understanding of what these institutions were designed to do. And I think that as we come together in solidarity among people of color and other oppressed groups, it's also important to understand the specificity of our oppression. So I just kind of want to speak back a little bit to what you called the first generation of Black college students, right? And I think it's important that we understand that in terms of class, it's a much more complicated conversation. So when you talk about them being the sons and daughters of business owners, we need to understand why Black entrepreneurship was so important, especially pre-1964, right? So my mother is one of those black college students, right? My grandfather owned the pharmacy in Beaumont, Texas. Why did he own the pharmacy in Beaumont, Texas? Because black people couldn't go to the white pharmacy, right? And so black entrepreneurship and black businesses emerged because of the imposition of segregation, because we had to have our own businesses because we couldn't go to white ones. So that doesn't make us middle class, right? It doesn't mean that my mother is like middle class students who might go to DU, right? It means that we had an expectation that we could develop ourselves into those who would lead our own communities. My mother often talks about having been raised in the segregated South, what we lost with integration, right? Not desegregation, with integration, right? What we lost with integration was the end of Fowler's Pharmacy, right? Because everybody thought it was better to go to CVS than go to Fowler's Pharmacy, as if that's, you know, they sell different medicine there or something, right? It's important that we understand that when my mother went to Spelman College, that it took every bit of all of the money that my grandma Lulu scraped up as a domestic worker to send her there. It took the neighbors, who included my grandfather, who was a pharmacist, and the next door neighbor who pumped gas at the black-owned gas station, right, to all pitch in to my mother's education. So I want to be real clear that when black students went to mostly black colleges, right, it wasn't because we were middle class in those terms. It's because we had a completely different experience. So it's important that as we work towards solidarity, we also work towards a deep understanding of the specificity of what we experience. So I just want to kind of address that, and I acknowledge the specificity that brown folks experience coming into academic settings which are created by white supremacy as well, right? But I want to lift that up. So what does it mean to incorporate race into my scholarship, teaching, and service? Again, I just want to kind of speak from the perspective, and can y'all help me, because I'm sitting up texting my friends going, I don't know if this is resonating. I want to be real clear, and this speaks to this question. I'm a black woman in every space, and what that means for me here is if y'all don't nod your heads or say, uh-huh, I don't know if I'm on track or not, right? We good? Good, okay. So I don't know how to not incorporate race into my scholarship, teaching, and service because I'm black, right? So, you know, I mean, either I lie, right, and try to pretend to be something I'm not, or I enter as myself, right? And so race is always incorporated, right? I always, and it doesn't always serve us well, right? It doesn't always serve us well according to institutional norms, right? But I think it's something that we must do, right? I'm thinking about, you mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois, when he earned his PhD from Harvard, he said, and the honor was all Harvard's, right? I'm thinking about how we enter institutions which are not our own, which were constructed to keep us oppressed, right? And how we enter them from that space of audaciousness, right? How we enter space and say, you know what, I know you want me to teach this class about, one of my first classes at Cal State LA that I had to teach was race and ethnicity in the United States, right? And they wanted me to teach the class as a survey of like all of the racial groups. Like, you know how they do that, they think diversity means like, let's taste all of the food from all the people around the world, right? We'll spend a week on indigenous people because they were here first, right? Then we'll spend a week on slaves. We were never slaves, we were always people, so we were enslaved people, right? Then we'll talk about Chinese immigration, right? And they want you to kind of do this like a buffet of people of color, right? What it means to enter as myself is say, look, I'm entering this space as a black woman, right? And I'm entering this space from ethnic studies perspective that was not born of the institution in which we're now housed, right? ethnic studies, black studies in particular, was born as the only discipline or set of disciplines that was born out of community struggle. It's the most enduring victory of the Black Power movement and of the Chicano movement, right? That we were born because communities and students and radical faculty demanded it, right? And in 1968 at San Francisco State University, I don't care, I don't know y'all. They shut that shit down for 4.5 months, right? And so they were willing to do that, and they won it because the institution was more afraid of what might happen if they didn't give it to us, right? And so when we think about entering institutions from that space, I'd be doing a disservice to who I am as a black woman. I'd be doing a disservice. I'd be dishonoring my grandmother, right? And I'd be doing a disservice to Mr. Navies, who was my first black studies teacher, and to the entire discipline of black studies if I taught race and ethnicity as a buffet of people of color, right? So what we're going to do is come into my classroom space, and we're going to engage in filling in gaps around subject matter, because our students are absolutely miseducated, right? This is Black History Month. Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Negro. If y'all ain't read it, go read it. That's your assignment for today, right? Carter G. Woodson struggled for and won Black History Week in 1926, and it was black students at Kent State University 50 years ago in 1969 who took the entire month of February, right? So it wasn't because, you know, February is the shortest month of the year, right? The government didn't give us Black History Month. We took it, right? And we took it because this month is Frederick Douglass's birthday, and there were a lot of people that Carter G. Woodson was intending to honor with this week. So we need to think about what it is we're struggling for. We need to think about, in the context of Black History Month, how we're teaching, in the context of being in a Black Studies department, what it is we seek to do. So we absolutely seek to fill in subject material. We seek to make sure that students know that Lincoln didn't free the slaves and Columbus didn't discover America, right? We seek to fill that in. But we also seek to move from a different pedagogical space where students come in, and when they were pulled over by the police last night, that's part of what we're talking about in class, right? So as we talk about policing evolving from slave catching, they understand that they were pulled over because police were designed to see targets on their backs, right? And so, yes, we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about what that makes you feel like. And more importantly, we're going to talk about what we as a collective can do about it. And then finally, as we move forward as scholars, because you're asking also about our scholarship, right? Our scholarship is not just something that I want y'all to read. All of us should read, right? All of us should be reading Manning Marable and Cedric Robinson about the Black radical tradition and Black Marxism, right? We should be reading Miseducation of the Negro. We should be reading Charlene Carruthers, right? And we should be reading all of these folks, right? But our research and the work that we do and the reading that we do and the scholarship that we produce shouldn't be just about the people in this room or the people in this university. The most important thing for our scholarship is that it can be used as a tool of revolution. It can be used as a tool to transform the world that we live in. That's the work that Johnny's seeking to do, right? Use his scholarship as a tool. When you're talking about radical activism among Chicano youth, Chicanx youth, right? That's about using your scholarship to empower transformative change. And so that's what our scholarship should be about. That's what our service should be about. Our service shouldn't be about serving on whack-ass committees with a bunch of white people who want to point to you and go, see, I got a black friend, right? Our service should be about how do we take the tools and resources of institutions and use it for the empowerment of our people.
There's a lot that we've already been offered to think about. So let me reiterate the invitation to use the note cards that are on each of your table. To jot down questions, thoughts that are coming into your mind as you're listening to this conversation, and please share that. I think somebody is collecting those. Yes, so someone is collecting those, and we'll bring them up to me as that happens. So as you're doing that, and as I'm hearing these comments from Mary and from Melina, I was reminded of Angela Davis's comment that freedom is a constant struggle.
Absolutely.
Freedom is a constant struggle, but struggle is hard, right? Struggle weighs on people. It weighs on families. It weighs on communities. It weighs on the ability to put food on our table. And so I'm wondering if you all can talk about some of the personal challenges, the personal costs, the opportunities that have arisen from challenges in your own life as you seek to do the kind of work that you are doing, the kind of work that is important to your identity, and to your profession, your professional careers. What are some of those challenges that you've encountered?
So I'm on trial right now. I don't know if you all know that, but so I'm an organizer with Black Lives Matter, and when we talk about challenging institutions, we have to remember that struggle doesn't come without sacrifice and without cost, right? So, you know, people like to put up photos of people shutting down freeways. I guarantee you that a good number of the folks who shut down those freeways wound up getting arrested for those freeway shutdowns, right? There have been jobs that I didn't get. There have been invitations that have been revoked. There's been costs that my children have paid, right? My oldest daughter, Tandiwe, is, my two daughters are the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard. And I think about the way in which my oldest daughter, who's now in 10th grade, has been targeted and put on lists in her school as a result of her work and as a result of my work. My son, when he was wrapping up his first grade year, so he was 6 years old, was visited by the gang unit of LAPD. And I'm sure it's nothing that he did because he was a 6-year-old, right? But it's targeting, right? There are regularly police cars at the end of my block. And those are all costs that are to be paid. But we have to remember that as we celebrate, you know, people, every politician in the world likes to trot out Martin Luther King as the example of what we should be, right? But if they thought it at the time, then Martin Luther King wouldn't have gotten assassinated, right? Martin Luther King was not the sanitized version that we're fed that had a dream about black children and white children simply holding hands, right? Dr. King was arrested 40 times, right? Dr. King reminded us that we have a moral duty to disobey unjust laws, right? Martin Luther King, his life was stolen as a result of his activism. So if we're to hold up Martin Luther King as this shining example of who we should be as organizers, then we have to remember the cost that he paid, right? And we have to be willing to pay at least some cost. I'm not saying that I want to be shot, right? I don't, right? But we have to be willing to say, and I'm going to be really honest, that before Black Lives Matter, I'm very aware that I was being groomed by black elite folks, by liberal folks to run for office or, you know, move up in terms of university administration. I was the black friend that they had over for dinner, right? And I remember a moment when a year into Black Lives Matter, we like to do these encampments in front of people's places of work or sometimes their homes, right? And Ezell Ford, the autopsy report on Ezell Ford, who was murdered by LAPD on August 11th, 2014, his autopsy report had come out. And in December of that year, we did an 18-day encampment in front of LAPD headquarters. It was the first encampment, the first occupation of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And after being in front of LAPD headquarters for 18 days, we were waiting on the ruling to come out from the police commission on whether or not Ezel's murder was in policy or out of policy. So we moved from LAPD headquarters to the mayor's house. And the mayor, whose number is in my cell phone, right, who used to invite me to stuff to sit on panels, right? I used to be like one of the favorite youngish black organizers, right? And black scholars, right, who was regularly at City Hall. So regularly, my name was on the permanent parking list, right? I was in front of the mayor's house, and I realized, you ain't never running for office now. And the voices of my ancestors began to whisper to me and say, so what? That's not your purpose, right? It's our sacred duty to live in our purpose, not to live according to our ambition or to live according to the plan that someone else has for us. And so there's a lot of challenges facing this work. If you're to do the work of dismantling oppressive institutions, the institution is going to clap back on your ass, right? And so it could mean, you know, you have to struggle for tenure. You may not get it, right? It could mean that you don't get the job that you wanted. It could mean that they disinvite you from things. But if your ancestors, if your community, if your own consciousness is telling you to do something, you are obligated. It is your duty to move in that way, whatever the cost.
I think the personal challenges. Personal career challenges that I'm aware of have been certainly funding. If you don't ask the question in a particular way, you won't get funding. So for instance, when I started my work on domestic workers in Denver, my emphasis was on race in comparison with the earlier work that was done by other women of color in sociology on the African American community and the Asian American community. And it never was funded, just as theirs wasn't funded. And it wasn't until later that when the generation of sociologists that came that were interested in looking at domestic workers, but not in terms of workers, but in terms of immigrants and how well they were adjusting to society and social mobility. That generation was funded for that kind of scholarship. So I understand, to a large degree, I think that there is some changing that's going on in the funding agency because there is a great need for research that can be used to address some of the social issues, but it's moving very slowly. Obviously, there's been positions that I haven't been considered for because my research sometimes has been defined as advocacy work rather than pure science, and that I feel I'm comfortable with. So I didn't need to have that job. I think that another challenge has been trying to get my students funded, because frequently if they do ask the questions in a particular way that would emphasize on race or emphasize structural issues, they tend not to be funded. They're being pushed to look again at assimilation, looking at mental health, looking at achievement rates in the universe or in education. And some of these harder questions are difficult to get funded.
So as you're talking about the challenges of being in the workplace and the importance of doing the work that you find to be motivating, you find to be important. One of the questions that I got from the audience comes to mind. As women of color, how do you navigate your politics and your activism while seeking tenure at a historically white institution? And if I could add to that, while also seeking positions of some amount of authority or influence, whether it's as the president of the ASA, the chair of the department, and so I invite you to address a question that came from our audience.
In terms of tenure and promotion, I've had a very different career than most academics. My first position, I was a lecturer position. The second one, I was assistant professor position. And I made the mistake of accepting the job on the basis of liking the work that the assistant professors in that department were doing. And then as I became an assistant professor, I slowly saw all of those individuals denied tenure and having to leave. And although the deans that I didn't need to worry about tenure, I realized I didn't want to be there, and I didn't feel that they had the right to be judging my work given who they were. And so I left that position, and I actually thought at that time of leaving academia, but someone suggested that I try an administrative position, and I did. So I took an administrative position, and I went to Yale for a couple of years, and that was a very different experience for me. Obviously, it was a non-tenure position, but it was an opportunity for me to learn about a different kind of educational system that's out there that I had never seen being in the state universities and never being in a private institution. So for me, I see those as 2 years of learning a great deal about the larger society and the way that power operates in the U.S. But there was a family tragedy while I was there, and I realized that I was just too far away from home, and I wanted to come back closer to home. So I took a position at San Francisco State as Chair La Raza Studies. And so all of my tenure promotions have been negotiated from the outside. I have never been tenured by or promoted by a department that I had already been into. And I suggest to many that that's a wonderful way to do it because the tenure and promotion period can get very ugly, especially if people are political in the department. But speaking from another side that I have much more experience on is constantly being called upon to write those external letters for my colleagues. And I don't get the calls to write the letters for Princeton or from Yale, but I get the ones that are from faculty that have been politically active, that have decided to engage in public sociology, that do a lot of blog writing and writing in the newspaper, and have tried to make their research as accessible to the larger audience as possible. And so I've worked very hard on trying to write a convincing external letter that explains how that is sociology, and it's good sociology, and it's good scholarship, and why it's important. And so I feel that that's sort of my role that I have at this moment.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll just add, so I was tenured at the university that I teach at and promoted and became chair at Cal State LA. I've only been at Cal State LA except for a couple of visiting positions at other universities. A great strategy is recognizing that your students are your base, right? And so if you can do a good job with your students, you can scare the people on the tenure committee into thinking about, because this is how institutions behave, right? What's going to happen if we don't give them tenure and promotion? And I'm not saying don't do the work, but they look for excuses to not do that, especially for activist faculty of color. They would like to not have problems on campus, right? Part of it, though, is building your student base. They're scared as hell about what will happen if they do something to me. I guarantee you that people in administration if they could quietly get rid of me, would. Some of them, not all of them, right? Some of them, because also my activism isn't just off campus, it's on campus, right? So I was part of a struggle for ethnic studies as a requirement at Cal State LA. And there were a bunch of faculty, most faculty, it was only the black faculty and a few radical white faculty who fought for the ethnic studies requirement, not even the other faculty of color. They took individual payoffs in order to oppose this ethnic studies requirement. So those folks who are now in administration, right, would love to see me gone. But guess what would happen if they tried to do that? One, I'm already a full professor. It would be very hard to do, and we're a unionized campus. But two, because the students appreciate me, because I am there for the students. And I want to be real clear, I'm good at my job, right? I'm a good teacher. I'm a great teacher, right? I do service because I believe in doing service, and that service for me doesn't just mean serving on committees, right? That service for me means that when my black students are houseless, they can come sleep on my couch and they know it, right? It means that sometimes I'll be part of the student shutdowns of housing that intended to kick students out of housing for winter break, when a good proportion of our students don't have anywhere else to go, right? And so if the university came for me, the university would have to face their wrath, right? So a good tool for promotion is making sure that you do a good job for those you're actually supposed to be there for. Don't just do your job kissing up to the dean, right? Forget the dean. It's about the students, right? It's about the community, and they'll back you if the university comes for you.
So how do we make? How do we go about making the academy a place that is? I'm gonna quote from another question we got from the audience. That is a worthy objective, because it's not obvious. As you're describing, it's not obvious that this is the place where one wants to spend the bulk of their professional lives, right? So the question asked in her book, Eloquent Rage, Brittany Cooper ponders what it means to shape a world around the black girl's fears, to create a world that is safe enough for her. I wonder, what does it mean to create an academy that is safe enough for a black girl to excel, and is that a worthy objective? A similar question, I think, is what do you think of what do you think our institutions should do to protect us as members of those institutions and to support us in the work that we do as activist scholars?
So that's impossible. The institution is not going to protect us, right? The academy is a place that we are, and we should use the resources and opportunities that we have here for a larger purpose, right? So what I think that we can find is pockets of support, pockets that we can create into the safest space possible. So for me, that's ethnic studies, black studies. My department, we call ourselves the intellectual arm of the revolution, right? It's a place where black students can come and deepen their intellectual selves. However, it is not the revolution, right? It is not going to, it's kind of a ridiculous and illogical position to think that the institution that was not created for you but was created in opposition to you is going to keep you safe. It's not, right? But we can take as much as we can, recognizing that this is not our space. This is not our space. So kind of like, and I'm thinking and talking at the same time, which is always a bad idea, but it's kind of like recognizing that this is the master's house, run up in it, take as much shit as you can, and bring it back out to the rest of us, right?
I watched how the Arizona State University didn't have a lot of support for a Chicano Studies program, and they never thought they would get it through. but they were very strategic about making their allies with Chicano legislatures throughout the state. And the Regents was quite surprised when they actually got the votes to do that. And once they were in, then other programs were easily able to get in. So I think that there is some more race scholars, race individuals in the university that you can start to build coalitions with and work strategically with to start to change things. I think I don't want to give up on the university because my family has paid generations of taxes that they have been able to get very little from. And being that I was the first generation to go to college, and my family goes back several generations in New Mexico, so they owe us a hell of a lot of money. And so I can't see turning the universities over to them, and I think that we slowly have to take them over. I see more scholars of color joining the university. I see more white scholars joining the university that are part of this movement to change education and to make it more transformative. I think we certainly have a long way to go. I think there's a lot of struggles, but I certainly think we can't give up on it. And I agree the university is not a safe place, but I think we can create and continue to explore and to continue to struggle to own this space.
So we've heard a lot about challenges. We've heard a lot about strategies. One audience member asks, but the session is called Rage. It's not called Passion. It's not called Strategizing. It's not even called Headaches. So what's the role of Rage in your scholarship and in the academy in general, and how do you express that? How do you use that emotion to do the work that you do?
I spent about a year reading the hateful writings of an anti-immigration group in Arizona called Mothers Against Illegal Aliens. And I was filled with anger and rage while reading that. And I remember my husband looking over my shoulder, and he said, "How can you continue looking at and reading that and analyzing it?" I said, "Because it's important. And information's got to get out. We have to understand where is this awful term anchor baby coming from, and where is this push for birthright citizenship coming from, and how are groups like this forming their propaganda, and who are the readers of this?" It was important to understand that. So I have to say I was filled with rage doing that research, but I tend not to bring that rage into a room because it's hard to hold. When I was doing the research with students on campus on a, what was it, research, it was us, we were working with the Phoenix Police Department to try and get them to address the issues of a recent police shooting of a 16-year-old who was armed with a kitchen knife and was shot 25 times because 6 officers weighing between 180 and 250 pounds wearing their bullet vests felt that their lives were in danger. And so working with those students was very important, and we developed an outreach to larger youth in the community to start to document the way the police officers were photographing the Chicanos and the youth in the neighborhood, how they were asking them to do gang signs before they took the photograph, and including all this. I was filled with rage when I heard about what was going on. I felt a lot of rage while I was working with them, but it didn't help to share that rage with the students. I wanted to hear their rage and be able to help them move that into the kind of advocacy work that they did. But believe me, sometimes people have mentioned to me, how did you talk about some of these immigration occurrences in Arizona in such a calm voice. It may be a calm voice, but believe me, there is an enormous amount of rage.
So I cuss a lot. That's. I think it's important that we don't try to mute our rage, right? If you think about what those who have power are now arguing, that we need to be more civil, then that's the opposite of what we should try to do, right? So I teach a class called Race Activism and Emotions. And we look at different emotions and we explore those emotions and talk about how it feeds activism. We use actually that book, Killing Rage by Bell Hooks, right? Which is a really important book that talks about the role of rage and the harnessing of rage. I believe that rage needs to be harnessed to fuel a movement, right? Anytime we talk about movements that have transformed things, right, it's begun with rage, right? Also with love, right? Also with lots of other things, right? It has to be rooted, though, in kind of a visceral response to what it is we're experiencing, right? It wasn't because somebody intellectually said, you know what, I think we should end the system of chattel slavery, right? Right, that's funny, right, to think about it that way, right? It was because they talk about family separation now. The reason why we see a disproportionate number, I believe, one of the reasons why we see a disproportionate number of black people engaged in work around family separation, ending family separation, and engaged in work at the border, because they say borders, but there's only assault on people at one border, right? Ain't no assault on people at the Canadian border, right? But I believe that the reason why, and many of us have been involved in a lot of work, especially at the San Diego border, the reason so many black people are involved in that work, especially around family separation, is because I believe in something called transgenerational memory, right? That the spirits of our great-great-great-grandmothers are reminding us of our own family separations. And it's why we move from that space. It's an emotional space. Rage is an emotion, but it's also, emotion is evidence of spirit, right? And so it's also moving from a spiritual space. And so I know in academies we're told to kind of, you know, not talk about spirit, not talk about soul, not even talk about emotion. But that's doing our movement a disservice because, children calling. Because the success of our movement has been about connecting with that piece of us, right? That's why it was funny to think about ending slavery based on some kind of, you know, intellectual processing, right? If you think about, you know, the first anti-lynching movement, right? It wasn't because Mama Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell and the Black Club women were moving from an intellectual space. It was an emotional space that's rooted in spirit. And so I think that we need to make sure that the academy, you know, they talk about entering institutions and then changing them from within. But we need to remember that more often than not, institutions change us. We don't change those institutions. So we need to beware while we're in these settings that we have to hold on to what's important to us, especially for people of color, right? We can't lose our souls in the space in trying to incorporate and assimilate into its norms. So rage is important, emotions are important, and soul and spirit are important.
And before I let you all go, let me add to that by asking you how you incorporate healing into the work that you do. It can be stressful, it can be dangerous, it can it can pose challenge after challenge after challenge. How do you incorporate a practice of healing into your scholarship and into your activism, and how do you encourage your students to do the same thing?
So somebody that just left, Tasira Soul Watson, Ashemu, who's with you all, right? Right. We got to know each other and became really good friends through a great trauma in both of our lives. And one of the things that he taught me to do is meditate. And he said, if you don't learn to meditate, you're going to lose your mind, right? I hope he's taught y'all that. Yeah, and so that's a practice that I've engaged in for the last 7 years. I meditate almost every day. And that's really important. I also think as we talk about healing, it's important to build what Dr. King spoke of as a beautiful struggle. So the struggle shouldn't just be daunting and you're giving everything and you feel like a martyr. And, you know, it's a sacred duty, but it also needs to be a beautiful struggle. So the people in it, like, we got to laugh, right? We got to, you know, turn up sometimes, right? We got to have parties. We got to celebrate birthdays and births of children and, you know, all of those things. We have to be alive, and I think that's really important. In terms of healing, I also want to caution us against too much of what they call self-care and what I call selfish care, right? So some folks talk about, like, some of the young folks will say sometimes when you ask them to do something, oh, I'm at capacity. What if Mama Harriet Tubman had said, you know, I would take y'all to freedom, but I'm at capacity. My feet hurt, right? We can't do that, right? So when it's our duty, we got to do the work. And we got to be really, really clear that we are in a place of war. War has been declared on us. And if you don't know it, then your head is buried in the sand. I hope you watched the State of the Union last night, right? I hope you paying attention to what this fool, but not just this fool, all of the majority of white people who voted for him, right? The majority did, right? So we got to be real about what we're facing, right? They've declared war on us. And so in a state of war, we don't have time to get to the deep healing, right? In a state of war, you got to spit on that wound and keep moving, right? And so let's do that. Let's build friendships within the, what do they call them, foxholes, right? Like, we going to be loyal to each other and watch each other's back, and sometimes we going to talk shit and laugh, but we also know we're at war. And so you got to keep moving. And selfish care means what you're doing is pushing your work off on me, right? And so all of us have to engage in the work of winning the war, winning this iteration of freedom struggle so that it's easier for the next one.
I think it's important to share our narratives with each other. I think too often, particularly in the educational system, we're forced to think that this is our problem or that somehow we did something wrong. And I think we constantly have to reinforce that the way in which the system was set up in a particular way, this operates in a particular way, and that's why this happens. And we need to share those experiences with each other. And it's very important not to get isolated from each other. And I think that's particularly important not only for faculty but also for students to rely on that collective friendship and collective scholarly help to get through this and to struggle together.
Well, two final notes. One, an invitation from my colleague, Paula Rhodes. The UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent is soliciting data analysis to assist them in conducting a mapping exercise of human rights work. If you're interested in getting more involved with that, please speak to Paula, who's sitting right here in the front table after the event. And the last thing is simply please join me in thanking Professor Mary Romero and Professor Melina Abdullah for joining us here today. Actually, that wasn't the last thing because I need to pass the mic back to
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just very quickly, this is not a conversation that stops today. It's an ongoing conversation. iRise wants to be at the center of it, at least on this campus, in this community, in this state, in this region. So please join us and continue the conversation. We are actually going to be launching a podcast around these same sorts of issues. That'll be launching in spring. And we also have some events we're going to be sponsoring and co-sponsoring coming up here. So please continue to engage in these conversations. Be rebellious. I think that's one of the things you heard about. Last year with iRise, we talked about the importance as we were thinking of this transition of sovereignty, self-determination, and solidarity, right? And I think what you're hearing in all this work is animated by all of that. So as we continue to move forward, certainly continue to engage with us in this work, continue to follow the wonderful trailblazing work of these scholars, and we look forward to working with all of you and connecting with all of you in the future. Thank you.